I swing open the gate and freeze. My private lake looks like a public pool. Strangers are splashing in the water, kids jumping off my dock smoke, curling from BBQ grills on my lawn. Music is blasting so loud the ground shakes. And right there, flipping burgers like she owns the place, the HOA president smirks and says, "You can't make them leave. This is community property." Why would she say that I paid for every inch of this land? I hit record on my phone, heart pounding. Tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Because what happens next will blow your mind. This lake was my sanctuary from the chaos of the city. I'm Mason, 35 years old, and I work as an environmental consultant testing polluted waterways and contaminated soil for the government. After weeks testing polluted waterways, owning a pristine lake felt priceless. I bought this lakefront cabin 6 months ago as my peaceful retreat from the city grind. The lake was the selling point. Completely private, sits entirely on my property, and the water is so clear you can see fish swimming 20 feet down. But apparently not everyone saw it that way. From the moment I moved in, Cheryl Stevens, 50, a former realtor turned HOA president, treated the board like her personal kingdom. She kept showing up whenever I was near. The lake always had some HOA rule to discuss, but her eyes kept wandering to the water like she was appraising something valuable. I swear she had some kind of radar for whenever I stepped outside. Her husband Keith is this mild-mannered guy who just nods along with whatever she says to keep the peace. You know the type. Nice enough on his own, probably would help you move furniture or jumpstart your car, but completely dominated by a controlling spouse who makes all the decisions. Months ago, she'd hinted the lake was worth more than I knew, a line I dismissed until now. At the time, I thought she was just making conversation about property values. Looking back, I realized that comment was way more calculated than I understood. But honestly, I was focused on enjoying my peaceful retreat, not analyzing every neighbor's strange remarks. Maybe I should have paid more attention to those visits, but I was just trying to be a good neighbor and avoid any unnecessary drama. My environmental consulting project in the city finished 3 days ahead of schedule last Friday. The client was thrilled with my contamination assessment report. I was exhausted from 2 weeks of soil sampling and water testing, and all I wanted was to get back to my cabin for some extra peaceful time before jumping back into the next project. I didn't tell anyone I was returning early. Why would I? The drive from the city takes about 2 hours through winding mountain roads, and usually by the time I pull into my driveway, the only sounds are birds chirping and maybe a fish jumping in the lake. So, when I turned the final corner onto my street around 4 p.m. on Saturday and heard loud music and voices, I figured someone nearby was having a weekend party. No big deal. People are allowed to have fun, and I'm not the type to complain about neighbors enjoying themselves. Cars lined the street. Strangers sprawled across my lawn grills, smoking kids jumping off my dock. My lake looked like a public park, and Cheryl stood center stage flipping burgers. She was laughing and talking with people I'd never seen before, gesturing toward my lake, like she was giving them a tour of her personal vacation resort. Some guy was teaching kids how to fish off my dock, while their parents lounged in lawn chairs they had brought from home. This wasn't just a few neighbors having a quiet get-together. This was a full-blown party with dozens of people, and they were treating my private property like a community recreation center. I hit record on my phone. Best decision I made all day. I walked up to Cheryl trying to stay calm, but feeling my heart pounding in my chest like I'd discovered burglars in my house. "Cheryl, what are you doing on my property?" Cheryl spun startled, then smiled like I'd crashed her party. "Oh my God, Mason, you're back early," she said, like I was the one doing something wrong by showing up at my own house unannounced. Why would I need to announce coming to my own home? What is this? I gestured to the crowd of strangers eating burgers and swimming in my lake, like they'd been invited to some kind of community festival. Her answer completely floored me and made me question whether I was losing my mind. "This is our community BBQ. We're using the community lake area." I actually had to take a step back and blink a few times. Community lake. This is my private lake. The confusion and anger in my voice was probably obvious to everyone within 50 feet, but Cheryl didn't apologize or look embarrassed. Instead, she doubled down like she was the victim of some terrible misunderstanding. She dialed 911, claiming I was the intruder. Her voice started shaking like she was genuinely scared for her safety. "Hello, police? There's a man who broke into our community event and he's threatening us. We're really scared. Please send someone right away." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was calling the cops on me for being on my own property, for asking why there was an unauthorized party happening in my backyard. Can you believe this? I had to call the cops to protect my own property from someone who was literally stealing it right in front of my eyes. I grabbed my phone immediately and tried to keep my voice calm and professional. "Police, I need to report trespassing on my private property. There's an unauthorized party on my land with dozens of people who don't have permission to be here." As I hung up, I looked around at all these strangers staring at me like I was the villain in this situation. Some of them were whispering to each other, probably wondering what kind of crazy person calls the police on an innocent community gathering. But here's the thing that really got to me. As I watched Cheryl fake that phone call, putting on this performance like she was genuinely afraid of me, I started to wonder if this was just bad judgment on her part, or if she was planning something I couldn't see yet. The way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, like she was calculating something. The way she'd been asking strange questions about my lake for months, always probing about property boundaries and community access rights. Something about this whole situation felt calculated rather than spontaneous, and that scared me more than any random trespassing incident should have. I mean, who just decides to throw a massive party on someone else's private property and then calls the police when the owner shows up? Either Cheryl had completely lost touch with reality, or she was playing some kind of game that I didn't understand yet. And judging by the confidence in her voice when she called me a trespasser on my own land, I was starting to suspect it might be the latter. As I watched her fake that phone call, I wondered if this was just bad judgment, or if I'd always been one without knowing it. The sirens cut through the party music like a knife through the tension that had settled over my property. I was standing on my own land surrounded by strangers with their coolers and lawn chairs, but somehow feeling like the bad guy in this bizarre situation. It's amazing how someone can flip a situation so completely that you start questioning your own reality and wondering if maybe you're the one who's wrong. 2 police cars pulled up, and I watched as Officer Johnson stepped out of the first one. He was a middle-aged guy with that serious cop expression, and the first thing that shocked me was how he immediately walked over to Cheryl with a friendly smile. "Mrs. Stevens, you called about a disturbance." Wait, they know each other. That little detail hit me like a cold splash of water. Here I am, the actual property owner with documents and everything, and the police officer's first instinct is to treat the trespasser like an old friend. It was clear Cheryl's reputation carried weight, but documents don't lie. She launched into an Oscar-worthy act calling me a threat to families. She ran over to Officer Johnson with tears actually forming in her eyes, her voice trembling with just the right amount of fear and confusion. "Officer Johnson, thank goodness you're here. This man crashed our peaceful community gathering and started yelling threats at families with children." She gestured dramatically toward the kids who were still dripping wet from swimming in my lake, looking confused about why the fun had suddenly stopped. Keith appeared behind her like a loyal backup dancer, nodding frantically and making worried faces that added credibility to her story. I watched this performance in complete disbelief, feeling like I had somehow stumbled into an alternate reality where up was down and black was white. She was making it sound like I had showed up screaming and waving weapons around, when all I had done was ask why there was a party on my private property. The way she said families with children was particularly clever because nobody wants to side against families with children. Officer Johnson turned to me, and I could see he'd already made up his mind about who was the problem here, based on Cheryl's tearful performance. "Sir, these folks say you disrupted their community event. Can you tell me what happened?" Even his tone was different when he talked to me. Polite but suspicious, like he was dealing with someone who might be unstable or prone to violent outbursts. "Officer, I'm the homeowner," I said, pulling out my keys and trying to keep my voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I came home to find all these people on my private property without my permission." But he still looked doubtful, like maybe I was some kind of confused renter or house sitter who didn't understand the situation. "Do you have proof of ownership? Mrs. Stevens is a respected HOA president here." Respected HOA president. The way he said it made it clear that Cheryl had spent months, or maybe years, building relationships and establishing herself as the trustworthy authority figure in this community. Meanwhile, I was just the new guy who kept to himself, and apparently couldn't be trusted to know which property was his own. But here's where being an environmental consultant actually came in handy for once. I always keep my property documents organized and easily accessible because land boundaries and water rights are literally part of my day job. I pulled out the official survey map and laid it on the hood. Officer, this shows the lake sits entirely within my property lines. There's no shared access or community designation anywhere in these documents. I spread the documents out, pointing to the specific measurements and boundary markers that clearly showed the lake was private property. You can see here the lake is completely contained within my property boundaries. Yet I watched Cheryl's face as I presented the evidence, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked genuinely worried instead of confidently indignant. Phones came out. I could see neighbors recording every second. The whole situation was turning into a public spectacle, and I could feel dozens of eyes watching to see how this would play out between the respected HOA president and the newcomer with his paperwork. Her confidence cracked when asked for her own paperwork. Cheryl tried to maintain her position, but I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice like water seeping through cracks in a dam. He's lying. This has always been community space. Officer Johnson, you know me, I would never lie about something like this. But when Officer Johnson asked her for her documentation to support her claims about community lake access, she started stammering and making excuses. I don't carry property papers to a BBQ, but everyone knows this is community space. We've been using it for months. The problem with lies is they fall apart when you ask for specifics and documentation. Officer Johnson was now carefully examining my documents, comparing them to something on his phone that I assumed was the county property database or mapping system. The longer he looked, the more his attitude shifted from suspicious to professional. Mrs. Stevens, if this is indeed private property, you need the owner's permission for any gathering. I could see the exact moment when he realized he'd walked into a situation where the respected HOA president was actually the one in the wrong. Cheryl's voice got higher and more desperate as her carefully constructed story started crumbling. This is impossible. We've had events here before. And that's when I realized she'd just admitted to multiple instances of trespassing on my property. Exactly. I said, probably a little too loudly, because the adrenaline was really kicking in now. She's been using my property multiple times without my knowledge or permission. Officer Johnson looked at Cheryl with completely new eyes, like he was seeing her for the first time, and realizing that maybe her reputation wasn't as solid as he'd thought. Coolers slammed shut, whispers rippled through the crowd as they scattered. Nobody wanted to be associated with an illegal gathering anymore, and I could see them whispering to each other and glancing at me with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. Johnson ordered the party to end immediately, and I watched as dozens of people packed up grilling equipment and loaded kids into cars in awkward silence. The whispered conversations and nervous side glances told me this story was going to spread through the community like wildfire, and I wasn't sure if that was good or bad for me. Cheryl stood there, watching her event dissolve into chaos and embarrassment, and when she finally looked at me directly, the hatred in her eyes was so intense, it actually made me take a step back. Keith hurried her toward their car, probably trying to get her away before she said something that would make the situation even worse for them. But as they drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the way she looked at me meant I'd just made a powerful enemy. The police cars pulled away, leaving me standing in my own driveway, surrounded by the debris of someone else's party, wondering what kind of retaliation was coming next. Something told me this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I watched the last car disappear around the corner, I realized that bringing down a desperate person might have just made them more dangerous than they had ever been before. Within 48 hours of the BBQ incident, my mailbox was stuffed with HOA violation notices, like Christmas cards from hell. Noise at 10 a.m., flowers without approval, car angle in my own driveway, petty attacks piled up fast. Her campaign was methodical, using HOA rules as weapons against me for daring to challenge her authority on my own property. According to the notices, I'd violated quiet hours, planted flowers without approval, and parked incorrectly in my own driveway. Each violation was more ridiculous than the last, delivered with bureaucratic efficiency, that suggested this revenge campaign had been planned the moment the police cars left my property. I realized Cheryl wasn't just trying to punish me for the BBQ incident. She was trying to make my life so miserable that I'd give up and move away, leaving her free to do whatever she wanted with my lake. But the violation notices were just the beginning of Cheryl's systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and drive me out of the community. She launched a full-scale social media offensive without actually naming me, but making it crystal clear who she was talking about for anyone who had heard about the BBQ incident. She posted in the community group about a new resident causing problems for our peaceful community and individuals who don't respect our shared values and traditions. The comments section became a nightmare of speculation and gossip with neighbors I'd never met, weighing in on my character and fitness to live in their world. People made assumptions about my background, personality, and intentions based on Cheryl's vague but clearly targeted posts. Some defended me, pointing out that everyone deserved to feel welcome, but others piled on with stories about unfriendly neighbors they'd dealt with before. Reading those posts felt like watching people discuss whether I deserved to exist in their community, and some comments were genuinely cruel in ways that made me question everything about this place I'd thought would be my peaceful sanctuary. That night, I opened a realtor site, typed the whole ad. My finger hovered over send, then I looked at the sunset on my lake and slammed the laptop shut. No way, I wasn't running. Man, for a second I almost gave up. Almost. I spent the entire evening browsing real estate websites, calculating moving costs, and drafting messages about needing to sell due to hostile community environment. The stress was affecting my sleep, my work concentration, and my general happiness in ways that made me question whether this fight was worth it. Part of me just wanted to escape this drama and find somewhere peaceful where I could enjoy my lake without dealing with a vindictive HOA president. Maybe Cheryl was right. Maybe I didn't belong in this community after all. But as I sat there looking at my beautiful lake, reflecting the evening light, like a mirror of everything I'd worked to achieve, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just a house or an investment property. This was my sanctuary, my escape from city chaos and environmental consulting work that dealt with pollution and contamination every day. This is my home. And if Cheryl wants to play rule games, I'll beat her at her own game using the same attention to detail I bring to environmental assessments. I deleted that email without sending it and committed to fighting back with the methodical approach I used for professional contamination reports. If she wanted to use HOA rules as weapons, I'd show her what happens when someone who actually reads the fine print decides to fight back with documentation and evidence. Papers sprawled across the table. A lone lamp cast gold light over tiny legal text. The clock ticked like a metronome in my ear as I traced every clause. My phone buzzed another violation notice from Cheryl. I gripped the pen so hard my knuckles turned white. Reading through every page of regulations, appendices, and amendments, I discovered that Cheryl herself had violated multiple HOA rules in her campaign against me. The social media policy clearly stated that residents couldn't post negative content about other community members even without naming them directly. The violation notice procedure required photographic evidence and a 7-day warning period before issuing official violations. She'd skipped both requirements completely. The community event policy required advance notice and property owner permission for any gathering on private land. Strike 3 for the BBQ party. I realized that Cheryl was so confident in her position as HOA president that she thought the rules didn't apply to her. That overconfidence was going to be her downfall, and I had the documentation to prove it. I triggered an HOA meeting using the very rules she ignored. I submitted my request with required signatures from 3 other residents who were curious about the drama and willing to support a public discussion. Cheryl tried to refuse, claiming my request was frivolous, but other residents pointed out that the rules clearly allowed any homeowner to call for a meeting with sufficient notice. She had no choice but to schedule it, though she tried controlling the narrative by announcing that I was wasting everyone's time with petty complaints. The room packed fast. Cheryl sat like a queen ready for a coronation. I could feel the tension as soon as I walked in, like entering a courtroom where everyone had chosen sides. She looked confident and slightly amused, probably expecting to publicly shame me and solidify her narrative about the problematic new neighbor who couldn't follow simple rules. When my turn came to speak, I didn't argue or get emotional about her social media campaign. Instead, I methodically presented my case like delivering a technical report to a government agency, staying calm and sticking to documented facts nobody could dispute. I showed video footage of my lawnmower running at 10:15 a.m., well within allowed hours. I displayed photos proving my flowers were planted entirely within my property boundaries, verified using the same survey equipment I use for environmental consulting. For the parking violation, I had pictures showing my car parked completely within my own driveway, where HOA parking regulations didn't even apply according to our governing documents. The room fell dead silent as I methodically destroyed each violation notice with clear evidence and proper documentation. But then came the part I'd been looking forward to all week. One by one, I dismantled her bogus claims, with evidence then dropped screenshots of her own rule-breaking posts. I pulled out printed screenshots from the community social media group highlighting specific sections in our guidelines about respectful discourse and the prohibition against posting negative content about other residents. And here's the interesting part. I said, watching Cheryl's face turn red as she realized where this was going. These posts appear to violate our community conduct rules regarding harassment and defamation of fellow residents. I had screenshots of every post, every comment, and every social media policy violation Cheryl had committed while trying to destroy my reputation. The room erupted in whispered conversations as people realized their respected HOA president had been systematically violating the same rules she was supposed to enforce. I also documented her procedural violations in issuing bogus notices without proper evidence or warning periods, presenting a timeline showing how all violations were issued immediately after the police incident as obvious retaliation. The meeting ended with uncomfortable silence and confused expressions as people processed what they'd heard. Several residents approached me afterward, some apologizing for believing the social media posts without question, others sharing stories about feeling intimidated by Cheryl's leadership style, but being afraid to speak up. Mrs. Henderson, a 70-year-old woman who used to be the HOA secretary, pulled me aside and said something that would change everything. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to her. There are things you need to know about Cheryl that go way beyond violation notices and social media posts. I went home that night feeling victorious about exposing her hypocrisy, but something in Cheryl's eyes when she left told me the real fight hadn't even started yet. She looked at me with the kind of cold calculation that made me realize I might have just backed a very dangerous animal into a corner, and now it was going to show me exactly how much damage it could do when it had nothing left to lose. Mrs. Henderson looked nervous, clutching a folder like it might burn her fingers. The 70-year-old former HOA secretary had information that went way beyond HOA politics, and the worried look in her eyes told me this was serious business. "I know what Cheryl really is," she said quietly. "She's not the person people think she is. I have information you need to hear." The cafe was nearly empty, just the hiss of the espresso machine cutting through silence. Mrs. Henderson slid a manila envelope across the table like it might explode, her hands trembled, eyes darting to every corner. "I've been silent for 2 years," she whispered. "But not anymore. I had no idea that this woman was about to blow my mind with revelations that would make the BBQ incident look like a minor disagreement between neighbors." The drive to town gave me time to wonder what could be so serious that a former HOA secretary felt the need for covert meetings like we were planning some kind of espionage operation. She brought a folder of financial irregularities she'd tracked for months. When we sat down, Mrs. Henderson spread out papers that looked like they'd been carefully collected over a long period. She'd seen shady numbers for years and kept quiet until now. Cheryl was very secretive about certain paperwork, especially anything involving land values or property assessments. The documents told a disturbing story that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning multiple years. Invoices matched Cheryl's renovations, payments went to shell companies, and improvement projects never happened. Professional consultation fees had no clear explanation of what services were provided. Community improvement projects somehow cost exactly the same amount as Cheryl's major home renovations, down to the dollar in some cases. The more I looked at these documents, the more I realized we weren't dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. We were looking at systematic financial theft from the community fund that had been going on for at least 2 years without anyone questioning the transactions. She'd tried to question Cheryl, but fear silenced her. Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to almost a whisper as she explained the pattern she'd noticed. I tried to ask questions about these transactions, but Cheryl always had explanations that sounded reasonable. Emergency repairs that needed immediate attention, professional consultations for community planning. It wasn't until I saw the pattern over several months that I realized what was actually happening. She pulled out a separate envelope. "I received this yesterday," she said, sliding it across the table with shaking hands. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. Stop interfering in things that don't concern you. There will be consequences if you continue asking questions. A note threatened her to stop digging. Mrs. Henderson, have you shown this to the police? She shook her head sadly. Who would believe me? Cheryl is so respected, and I'm just an old woman with accusations. But now that you're involved, maybe we can actually do something about it. I realized that Mrs. Henderson had been carrying this burden alone for 2 years, watching someone steal from her community, but feeling powerless to stop it because of Cheryl's reputation. But there was more to the story that revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. While we were going through the financial papers, Mrs. Henderson pulled out one more document she'd found when cleaning out her secretary materials. Hidden among HOA files was a detailed survey of my lake, complete with notes on its commercial potential. This wasn't just any survey, it was a comprehensive land analysis that included detailed notes about water sources, land composition, and drainage patterns. Comments revealed plans for tourism and water bottling. There were handwritten notes about natural spring source provides exceptional water clarity, unique filtration system through underground limestone, and high potential for recreational and commercial development applications. Someone had paid for a professional assessment of my property's commercial value, and that survey was hidden in Cheryl's HOA files like a secret treasure map. We decided to request access to the complete HOA financial records, which is every homeowner's legal right according to our community guidelines. She tried every delay tactic, claiming some records were confidential, others were being audited, and some had been misplaced during office reorganization. But we were persistent and eventually gained access to the HOA office during official business hours with another resident as a witness. What we found was worse than either of us had imagined and painted a picture of systematic fraud that had been carefully planned and executed over months. Hidden among the legitimate financial files were multiple property surveys, all focused on my lakefront property, with different companies and different dates spanning back almost a year. Someone had been researching my property's value and development potential long before I ever met Cheryl. The surveys included detailed analysis of water quality, mineral content, seasonal flow rates, and environmental impact assessments that would be necessary for commercial development applications. We were photographing the documents when we heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heels hit the tile like gunshots. Cheryl appeared in the doorway like a thundercloud, her eyes ice cold and voice barely controlled. "What are you two doing here?" she demanded, scanning the table where we had papers spread out and clearly recognizing some of the documents we'd discovered. "We have the right to review public HOA records," I answered calmly, but my heart was racing. "Some of these documents are confidential board business," she said, reaching for the property surveys with quick, desperate movements. But I was quicker, pulling them back before she could grab them. "What HOA documents are confidential? And why do you have multiple property surveys of my land mixed in with community financial records?" She didn't have an answer because there was no legitimate explanation for what we'd found. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds, she turned and walked away without another word, but the threat in her silence was louder than any words could have been. Mrs. Henderson and I packed up the documents quickly and left both of us shaken by the encounter, and realizing we'd stumbled onto something much bigger than HOA politics or neighbor disputes. Looking at those property surveys, I realized we weren't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president who didn't like being challenged. We had uncovered what appeared to be a calculated scheme that had been in the works for months, and my peaceful lakefront cabin was sitting right in the middle of someone's elaborate plan to commit what looked like large-scale property fraud. The evidence we'd gathered painted a picture of someone who had been planning this theft for much longer than I'd imagined, using her position of trust to research, plan, and execute a scheme that could have destroyed my life while making her rich. Now I understood why she'd been so interested in my lake from day one, and why she'd been so determined to establish community use through that BBQ party. This wasn't just about power or control, this was about money, and lots of it. The scope of her planning was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its potential for success, making me realize that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem most trustworthy and respectable on the surface. We used the bylaws against her rules she thought only worked in her favor. When our petition landed with the required signatures, Cheryl had no choice but to schedule the emergency meeting. She tried stalling, sending emails about frivolous claims, then shifting the time to 7 in the morning, but neighbors pushed back hard. Thursday night became the battleground, and everyone knew it. The clubhouse lights burned bright, like stage lamps casting long shadows across faces eager for drama. Folding chairs scraped the floor, voices hummed with speculation, and the air carried that sharp scent of tension you only smell before a storm. Cheryl sat at the head table, like royalty summoned for judgment, her back straight, jaw tight. When I walked in, every eye turned. I carried a thick folder under my arm, each page a nail for the coffin she'd built with her own hands. Keith sat beside her, fingers drumming on his phone, avoiding eye contact, like a man wishing he could disappear into drywall. I felt the weight of whispers prickling my skin, some hopeful, some hostile, all hungry for answers. Mrs. Henderson sat near the front, her folder tucked close like contraband, her face a mask of quiet steel. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner, an odd mix that somehow fit the occasion. This wasn't just a meeting. It was Judgment Day, and I was the one holding the matchbox. "Thank you for coming," Cheryl began, her voice steady, but pitched too high, betraying the nerves boiling under her lacquered calm. "Let's keep this civil. We're here because of allegations." Her eyes sliced toward me, sharp as glass. I waited, letting her words hang in the stale air like smoke. Then I stood slow and deliberate, like a man lifting the lid on a coffin everyone pretended wasn't there. "This isn't about opinions," I said, voice low, but carrying. "It's about facts." I placed the first sheet on the table, the paper snapping like a gunshot in the hush. Community funds, $15,000 gone, not mismanaged, stolen. A ripple tore through the crowd. Gasps, whispers, the scrape of a chair leg against tile. I didn't look at Cheryl, not yet. Invoices for projects that never happened. I continued flipping pages like cards in a game she couldn't win. Payments to companies that don't exist. Improvement fees that magically match her personal renovations down to the dollar. Phones appeared, screens glowing as neighbors recorded every syllable. The silence between my words was deafening, broken only by someone's quick, shallow breath from the back row. When I finally met her gaze, her face was pale, tight, a mask cracking under its own weight. She screamed coincidence until the evidence stacked like bricks on her chest. That line burned in my brain as I watched her unravel. "Coincidence," she said again and again, like repetition could make the truth blink. She gestured wildly, her nails clicking against the table, her voice a jagged blade. "Those contractors went out of business. Those numbers are clerical errors. You don't understand how these things work." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. I saw it in their faces, the shift from doubt to rage, from loyalty to betrayal. Each excuse she hurled landed like a stone in a well sinking fast, leaving nothing but ripples of disbelief. Then came the knockout blow. Mrs. Henderson rose slowly like a ghost reclaiming life. Her voice was soft, but carried through the room with the weight of judgment. "I watched these transactions," she said. "I was told to stay silent. I won't anymore." She laid her own papers on the table, each page a dagger drawn from months of fear. The room erupted. Voices surged sharp and furious, slamming against the walls like waves in a storm. "She stole from us," someone shouted. Another voice cracked with anger. "All those dues gone." The frenzy spread like fire, burning through the last scraps of Cheryl's defense. A vote was called before the echoes even faded. Hands shot up, a forest of judgment rising against her. The result was brutal, unanimous, but for Cheryl's trembling hand and Keith's half-hearted attempt at solidarity. When the gavel struck, the sound was final, a coffin nail hammered home. She sat, frozen eyes glazed like shattered glass, her mouth working, but no sound spilling out. Then slowly she stood, gathered her papers with fingers that shook like brittle branches. Her heels clicked across the tile hollow as an empty promise. No one spoke as she passed, no one reached out. The queen had fallen, and the silence was louder than any scream. Outside, night draped the parking lot in shadows, the air electric with murmurs and headlights slicing through fog. I lingered by the doorway, folder clutched against my chest, watching neighbors spill into the dark, like exiles from a broken kingdom. Some stopped to grip my shoulder, their eyes saying what words couldn't: relief, gratitude, maybe even pride. Mrs. Henderson brushed past, her voice a low murmur meant only for me. "It's not over," she said, "not by a long shot." Then she was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving her warning burning like a fuse in my brain. And Cheryl. She didn't look back, not once. But as her taillights bled red across the asphalt, I felt a chill snake down my spine, a whisper of something unfinished, something feral in the way her silhouette clung to the night. I knew then this wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. Because people like Cheryl don't go quietly. They don't fold, they sharpen. And in the silence that followed, in the breathless dark beyond those headlights, I could almost hear it. The grinding of teeth, the tightening of claws, the storm gathering just beyond the trees. The fallout was brutal. Cheryl's kingdom collapsed in less than a week, her supporters scattering like leaves in a storm. Keith turned into a ghost at community gatherings, muttering half-hearted apologies, before slipping away like a man embarrassed by his own shadow. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over. I thought removing her from the HOA throne was the final battle, but Cheryl wasn't done, not by a long shot. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. And when that certified letter landed in my mailbox, thick as a brick and stamped in bold red, I knew the next round had begun. The letter read like a threat in legal poetry. Defamation, character assassination, and damages exceeding $50,000. It demanded a public apology and financial compensation or face severe legal consequences. For 10 minutes, my pulse hammered like a war drum. I wondered if I had miscalculated, if exposing her in public had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But then I called my attorney friend, and his laughter cracked through the phone like sunlight through storm clouds. "Truth, Mason," he said between chuckles. "Truth is a shield. She's bluffing. She'd never survive discovery." His calm turned my fear into fire. She was playing her last hand and losing. Still tension thickened like smoke. Neighbors who once waved now stared through blinds, their silhouettes ghostly against yellow lamplight. The rumor mill churned on overdrive, grinding me into a caricature in whispers. I could almost hear the troublemaker, the outsider, the man who took down the queen. Every trip to the mailbox felt like crossing a battlefield. Twice I found my trash bin knocked over, its contents spilled across the driveway like an unspoken warning. One night, a sound gravel crunching under slow steps froze me mid-breath. I flung the door open to find only shadows swaying with the pines. Maybe paranoia, maybe not. Either way, I stopped sleeping easy. I threw myself into the one mystery, still bleeding at the edges, the hidden property surveys. Henderson's voice echoed in my head like a warning bell. "You don't know how deep this runs." I sat in my cabin with the papers spread before me, and then it hit like a gunshot. I studied the survey and froze. This wasn't for homeowners, it was a developer's dream sheet. Handwritten notes curled along the margins like whispers of greed. Premium access, potential, water rights, negotiable, high value, projection. My lake, my sanctuary wasn't just beautiful, it was currency, a jackpot waiting to be claimed. And Cheryl had mapped the whole score. I pushed back from the table and went to the window cart, pounding like I'd opened classified files. Outside, dusk smothered the tree line in shadow, and for a flicker I saw it, a figure still as stone between the pines. Watching, my breath caught. Then a gust bent the branches and the figure dissolved into the forest. Wind, I told myself. Just wind. But the hair on my arm stood stiff with warning. I killed the lights and waited, listening for the gravel crunch, the snap of a twig. Nothing. Only silence, heavy and unnatural, pressing against the glass like a held breath. Fear wasn't foreign to me, but this felt personal, intimate. Her entire HOA crusade suddenly made perfect sense, a blueprint for theft hidden in plain sight. The BBQ stunt, the violation notices, the smear campaign. They weren't random lashes of a power-drunk neighbor. They were stepping stones on a path, each move calculated to set legal precedent to force me out without lifting a single obvious weapon. And God help me. I had walked right into it. I pictured her leaning back in some dim room, lips curled in that smug smile, already counting profits from a lake I almost surrendered without a fight. Rage flared sharp enough to burn off fear. If I had underestimated her before, that ended now. The more I stared at those papers, the clearer her ambition sharpened. This wasn't a backyard squabble, it was a heist in designer shoes. Every polite just checking in visit recon. Every community first speech cover fire. And for what? For water, a resource so rare it could bankroll a fortune. That survey wasn't theory. It was a loaded gun aimed at everything I loved. I imagined the signatures, the sealed deals, the bulldozers tearing through my sanctuary. No, not happening. Not while I had breath left to fight. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof ironclad enough to survive courts and headlines. So I called in a favor I'd been saving for years. The specialist was an old colleague from an environmental audit project, the kind of guy who spoke in hard numbers, not hopeful guesses. He ran the tests without asking why. And 2 days later, his text hit like a thunderclap. Mason, this lake isn't just clean, it's exceptional. That was all I needed to know. The survey hadn't lied. Cheryl had been right about one thing. I was sitting on something rare, something that could rewrite futures in dollar signs. But now I had independent confirmation, and with it came a grim clarity. This wasn't a victory lap. This was escalation. Cheryl wasn't vanishing quietly. She was regrouping, and desperate people don't retreat, they reload. Night fell heavy, wrapping the cabin in silence thick enough to choke. I locked the folder in my desk, double-checked windows, slid the bolt on the door. That's when it came the knock. 3 taps. Slow, measured, like someone feeling for cracks in my nerve. I yanked the door open to nothing but darkness and pine air sharp as knives. Then I looked down. A note sat on the porch, folded neat ink slashed in hard strokes. This isn't your fight. My blood iced. My eyes lifted to the tree line pooling in shadow, every rustle now a threat. Cheryl had lost the crown, but somewhere beyond those trees, the game had just begun. The audit confirmed it. My lake was worth 6 figures more than anyone guessed. Seeing that number in black and white made my stomach tighten, like a rope pulled too hard. Everything suddenly locked into place, the barbecue, the fake violations, the harassment. It wasn't about control or power. It was about greed dressed up in HOA bylaws. Cheryl had seen gold where I saw peace, and she nearly pulled it off. Nearly. Because now I had the evidence and I was done playing defense. It was time to make sure everyone knew exactly what she'd tried to do. I scheduled a community-wide meeting for Saturday night, the kind of event where word spreads faster than wildfire. By the time I arrived, the clubhouse was so packed that people lined the hallway and spilled onto the lawn. Flashlights bobbed outside, and I even spotted a local news van parked near the entrance. Perfect. I wanted witnesses. Cheryl wasn't in sight, but her shadow hung over the room, like smoke that refused to clear. Every conversation dropped when I stepped inside carrying a folder thick enough to break bones. This wasn't going to be a polite HOA meeting. This was an execution by truth. Thank you all for coming, I started, voice steady, though my pulse pounded like a drum in my chest. Tonight isn't about opinions, it's about facts. I laid the first packet on the table and watched the ripples of curiosity spread through the crowd. Bank statements, fake invoices, property surveys, they were all there, highlighted in screaming yellow. For months we trusted someone to lead with integrity. I said, my gaze sweeping the room. But these documents tell a different story. Murmurs started low and then swelled like an oncoming storm. I flipped to the next page and dropped the bomb. Community funds over $15,000 diverted into projects that never existed. Gasps cracked the silence. A man in the back muttered, "Unbelievable," while someone else hissed Cheryl's name like it burned their tongue. I didn't pause. It didn't stop there, I continued. Hidden among financial files were property surveys not of public land but of my lake, detailed reports with commercial development notes. Her endgame: force me out and cash in. The room exploded into angry voices, some people standing so fast their chairs clattered to the floor. Phones came out, screens glowing as residents snapped photos and recorded video. Good. Let the world see this. Every shred of it. Halfway through, Cheryl walked in. And for one insane second, the room froze like someone hit a switch. She looked smaller, shrunken in a way that had nothing to do with height. Her eyes darted like cornered prey, searching for allies that weren't there. "This is a lie," she shouted, slamming a manicured hand on the table. "He forged those documents. He's obsessed with destroying me." Her voice cracked on the last word, splintering into raw panic. I didn't shout back. I didn't need to. "Then explain this," I said quietly, holding up the survey with her handwritten notes, curling along the margins like fingerprints of intent. For a moment, all I heard was her breath, a shaky staccato that filled the silence like static. Then she broke. "You think you're better than me?" she snapped, tears streaking her makeup like war paint. "I gave this community everything and you ruined it." The room answered with a tidal wave of outrage. People she'd charmed for years were now spitting words like thief and fraud. Someone motioned for a vote and hands shot up like arrows. By the end, Cheryl was stripped of every title, every ounce of authority, and every illusion of power she'd wrapped herself in. She left without another word, her heels clicking a hollow rhythm that sounded like the last nails sealing her own coffin. The fallout was swift. The local paper ran the headline the next morning, HOA president ousted amid fraud allegations. By Tuesday, regional news picked it up. Reporters camped near her driveway, cameras flashing like lightning every time she cracked the blinds. Her lawyer dropped the case in silence. Keith filed for divorce and vanished from the community like smoke and wind. Cheryl, once the self-anointed queen of our neighborhood, was now a pariah with her name etched in every newsfeed for all the wrong reasons. Justice wasn't loud. It was surgical, and it left scars she couldn't hide. As for me, I sat by my lake one evening watching sunset paint the water in molten gold and let the quiet sink in. The ecotourism company's proposal rested on my lap and is crisp with promise, guided tours, educational programs, preservation guarantees. Profit without destruction. A future built on respect, not greed. I signed the preliminary agreement the next day, sealing a deal that turned my lake into a sanctuary instead of a battleground. Sometimes the best revenge isn't fire or fury. Sometimes it's proof that you can't burn what refuses to catch. Months later, the final twist came with a phone call that made me laugh out loud. A documentary crew wanted my lake featured in a film about hidden natural treasures, spotlighting how one community fought corruption and chose conservation over exploitation. I pictured Cheryl watching that premiere from some anonymous apartment far away, her name never spoken, but her shadow lingering like a cautionary tale. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need revenge speeches. I had something better, peace, purpose, and the glassy shimmer of a lake that almost slipped through my fingers. Funny how life works. The thing she tried to steal became the thing that set me free. And you know what? Sitting by that lake now, I just keep thinking peace isn't free, but it's worth the fight. Guess the lesson is document everything and never underestimate friendly neighbors. If this story hit you, drop a comment, hit like, or tap that thanks button to keep QA stories going. All right, I'll see you around soon.
Another wild tale courtesy of QA Stories. If your jaw's on the floor, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay shocked.